Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to another video. As you can see, we are not in our usual setting. We are back in hospital. We had a little bit of an emergency situation early hours of this morning, which I think would not sting so bad if it wasn't Avery's birthday today. It is the 6th of March and Avery turned 2 today, and we have spent the entire day and will spend the entire night in hospital. Sad, but I will update you on what kind of happened, what's going on when we're home and settled. We are really hoping that we will be discharged tomorrow. As if this week wasn't hard enough already. Yeah, I'll fill you in more when we get home, but this is how we are spending Avery's birthday this year. Hey guys, it is now the next day and we're home, obviously. I think this is going to end up being a pretty short and sweet video. It's definitely not the video I had planned. The video I planned for this week was to start it by filming Avery in the morning, first thing on her birthday. Going into her room, singing her happy birthday, giving her all the love and cuddles. And that just wasn't our reality. So I'm just going to give you an update, basically, what happened. So Avery took a bit ill on the Sunday. So we had her birthday party on the Saturday. The Sunday she was a bit poorly, she had a bit of a horsey cough, a little bit snotty, but overall generally in herself she was well, she was happy, she was her usual self. In the evening she started to get a little bit warmer, and I said to Josh I felt like she may potentially spike a fever in the night, so we should give her paracetamol and ibuprofen before she goes to bed, which we did. Went to bed. At 10:30 I went to give her usual meds and plug her into her SATS monitor, and I did notice her oxygen was on the lower side. It was around 92, 93, and just to err on the side of caution I decided to put her SATS monitor kind of further up in the room so that I could see it on her baby monitor. Her monitor would alarm if anything went wrong anyway, and I would hear it. It generally does wake me up, but I just wanted to be able to see it on the camera as well when I did wake up, just to see what is going on. So I went to sleep, and at 3 AM the alarm started going off and her oxygen level was at 60%. Now in the hospital they said that's probably not accurate, but for it to say 60% then I know it must have been very low. When I walked into her room, she was laying on her back, and by the way, I am going to be quite descriptive in this video, okay, so just to throw out a bit of a trigger warning here. If you are easily triggered or easily upset about hearing things like this, then perhaps you should skip this video. But yeah, so I walked into her room and she was laying on her back, which is how she sleeps, and her mouth was just all foamy. She was completely covered in foam, she was breathing very raspily. So I turned her onto her side until she cleared it, and then she fell straight to sleep after that. She was zonked. Now in hindsight, looking back at that was probably a very small seizure that I completely missed, just because of how fast she fell to sleep and the raspy breathing. So after that, naturally I didn't really go back to sleep. I kind of laid watching the monitor, and at 4 o'clock her monitor started to alarm again. So immediately I was alert, I was watching the monitor, and her heart rate was spiking. Not only that, I noticed that she was making some jerky movements. Now Avery has had febrile convulsions before, or what we thought were febrile convulsions, and the movements did not look the same. These were different. This was very twitchy, repetitive twitches, and then when I went into her room, she was very unresponsive. She was again raspy breathing, and she was very foamy at the mouth. And this time when I turned her onto her side, it didn't stop. Trying to hold her down, it didn't stop, and I immediately knew that she was seizing. She was hot, so she had spiked a fever, and I forgot to mention that at 3 AM we did give her another dose of paracetamol because she was starting to feel hot then. So she was already an hour into having paracetamol again, but obviously that didn't calm the fever down. So at that point we phoned the hospital, and I think if we hadn't moved so close to the hospital then we definitely would have been phoning an ambulance. Luckily we do only live about in no traffic, which there wasn't at that time of night, 5 to 10 minute drive to the hospital. So we quickly gathered our stuff, we got the boys out of bed, we got in the car and we headed straight to hospital. When I was on the phone to the children's ward, her seizure did stop. It did stop, so she wasn't seizing when we got her into the car. We wouldn't have done that, we would have just called an ambulance. Bearing in mind this was her birthday. This was 4 AM on her birthday. Avery was born at 4:37 AM, so it was very, very close to her birth time. 3 days later on the 9th, I woke up at 4 AM to her not breathing, and she was in cardiac arrest. So just the fact that it was that time, I think, made that whole situation so much more scary, just because it brought back a lot of emotions. It brought back a lot of feelings that we felt in that night, and I know that Josh must have felt very similar to the way I did. It was a very scary experience. When we were in the car at exactly 4:17 AM, Avery started to seize again, and what was scarier this time is that it wouldn't stop. Normally seizures that Avery has had have not lasted more than a couple of minutes and she comes out of them fine. This one didn't stop. So by the time we had pulled up to the hospital, it still hadn't stopped. I grabbed Avery out the car and ran her up to the children's ward. Josh went off and parked the car. By the time I got into the children's ward, I went and found the kind of office where all the doctors and the nurses sit at, because normally you kind of wait in the corridor for someone to come out to you, but there was no way I was waiting at that point. And I just said to them, she started having another seizure, it's not stopping. So immediately they pulled the buzzer, which then gets everyone that can do something into the room. So in that moment it very much felt like an emergency situation. So there are a good few doctors and nurses surrounding Avery at this point, doing the usual, asking a lot of questions, running tests. I know they did a blood gas, which is basically like a pinprick blood test that they did in her toe. They straight away put her into the recovery position and they gave her a rescue med, which is buccal-midazolam. Now that in itself made me very nervous, because it was not an oral medication, but it was a medication that they needed to put into her mouth at the sides of her cheeks, and it apparently absorbed into her cheeks. I did make them aware that she was nil by mouth and she would choke on that much liquid, but they said don't worry, it absorbs very, very quickly. She did calm down a few minutes later, and that then gave the doctors kind of chance to ask a lot more questions. The usual, what meds is she on, has she been unwell, does she have a fever, and they then took her temperature. She did have a fever. You know, family history, the usual. They plugged her into some oxygen then, and they wheeled her into a room, a cubicle. They were still kind of asking a lot of questions and kind of talking amongst themselves at that point. All the while, Avery didn't sleep, which we were kind of expecting her to after that medication, and they said that this will help her body rest, and what she really needs to do now is rest and reset her brain. But her eyes were not shut, her eyes weren't closing. She was very, very glazed over, but her eyes didn't close and her eyes were flickering from side to side very, very quickly. Now the doctor said this could be just kind of an after side effect of the seizure. They called it nystagmus, is that what it's called? I might be pronouncing that wrong, but it sounds something along those lines. She carried on doing that for quite a while, and then Josh started to notice that she started twitching again, and we called the nurses in, and then it turned into another full-blown seizure. Again, this seizure didn't stop on its own. They had to administer a second dose of the rescue med. After this med, she did go to sleep. She dropped off to sleep about 10 minutes after, and that's kind of when the seizure ended. But at that point then, her oxygen started to drop quite a bit, so they immediately had to up the oxygen. And the med in itself is a muscle relaxant, and what they've said is, especially because she's had 2 doses, the likelihood is her airways, the muscles in her airways would have relaxed too. So they had to keep her in a recovery position. The nurse at one point had to keep her hands here to physically open her airways just to keep her oxygen levels up. And again, that was all really scary. After that, after they had kind of stabilized her, they let her rest. A doctor came in to put a cannula in. They did an x-ray. On the x-ray they said that there was some changes on her lungs, so it could have likely been a chest infection or aspiration pneumonia again, so they immediately put in the cannula and started IV antibiotics. Luckily Avery was totally out of it at this point, so she barely stirred when they put the cannula in. And the poor boys, I mean, they were with us. We kept kind of going off to talk to them, make sure they were okay. The hospital very kindly gave them an iPad to play on. I asked if they would sleep, if they wanted to sleep, because it was still very early in the morning, but they didn't want to. But yeah, once the room kind of cleared out, we just let Avery rest. And a few hours passed. The boys got given some breakfast, which was again very nice. They did a test on her secretions, so they took her secretions off to test, and they also did bloods to send off to test. So we are still waiting on those test results to find out if the root of all of this was viral or bacterial. I mean, she had a really good run. She had 6 months where she was barely ill at all, so this really kind of came out of the blue. Josh went off then and took the boys to school, and we just wanted to keep things as normal as possible for the boys. So he did explain to the teachers what had happened, and just to give the boys a little bit of grace. If they are tired, let them rest, which I think they understood. He then came back to the hospital, and that day really was quite slow. Avery was still very doped up on the midazolam. It took her quite a long time to come out of that, so the doctors couldn't really assess her awake state yet. We did talk to them about, you know, what was going on. So she'd had the febrile convulsions before, but they didn't look the same. And the doctor said, well, actually, in a child like Avery, who has the brain injury and who is medically complex, I wouldn't have diagnosed febrile convulsions as such, because the nature of febrile convulsions kind of suggests that children will grow out of them. Avery will not likely grow out of these. This is more likely to be on the epileptic side, where she is on the levetiracetam, so her seizures or any seizures are being controlled, but if she has a fever or she is unwell, then a seizure is likely to break through. And most likely we are looking at this to continue into the future, which we always knew was a possibility. It doesn't make it an easier pill to swallow. So as it stands now, they have increased her levetiracetam dose, and we have been sent home with rescue meds should she have a prolonged seizure at home. Now, this doesn't mean that we would be managing a prolonged seizure at home. The idea is, if she has a seizure that lasts longer than 15 minutes, we give her the rescue and we take her straight to hospital. Because we don't know if her oxygen is going to drop, and they're also going to want to find out the root of that seizure, because usually it signals some kind of infection, which was definitely the case here. But it just happened so quickly. Like, yes, she was poorly on the Sunday, but nothing that we hadn't seen before, and she was still really well in herself. She was happy, and just all of a sudden these seizures, and she'd never had more than one seizure at once, not since her acute stage, and I think that's what made it scary, because before, one would pass and that was it was done, the worst was over, but they just kept coming. And we spoke to her community nurse today as well, and with the eye flickering, she said that it could have been that between the second and third seizures, which were both long seizures in themselves because they both needed to be stopped with rescue med, she may not have come out of seizure in between those times. That eye flickering could have been that seizure continuing on, or it could have just been kind of an after effect of having a seizure. We just don't know. So we are getting back in touch with Avery's epilepsy nurse, We are going to make sure that we carry on with the investigations in terms of if Avery could potentially be epileptic. That is kind of the route we need to go down with her paediatrician and her neurologist. I did manage to capture a video of the seizures this time because her neurologist keeps asking me to, which is a very strange feeling. You know, that is definitely not your first response, but I knew that in the long run that would be very helpful, so I have that video ready to show to him. I'm not sure what, you know, they can really tell me from the video. It was pretty obviously a seizure, but yeah. So we're home now. Avery is doing much better. She is pretty much, the med's completely gone out of her system now, the midazolam. She's back to herself, she's smiling, she's poorly, she is all stuffy, but she's a million times better than what she was. So that is how we spent Avery's second birthday, and I feel really sad about it because it's a hard time of the year anyway. I was trying my hardest to stay positive for that day, just have a nice day with Avery, and this happens. So we've hit a low this week, guys, but it's fine. Avery is fine. Thank goodness we had the SATS monitor. I don't want to think about what would have happened if we didn't, but that is my update, and that is where I'm going to leave this video, just because I think we all as a family need to just take it easy and rest now for a couple of days. So with that said, I will see you guys in a few days. Bye guys.